In the rural stretch of Jefferson County, Arkansas, where the Mississippi fog clung to the ground like memory refusing to lift, a man named Elmer Grigsby earned an unfortunate local fame, one not born of heroism or war, but of something more. Bewildering. Elmer, a modest blacksmith with a withered leg and a quiet gaze, was known among the townsfolk for a tale that defied common sense, rattled the doctrine of the local preachers, and raised questions that still had no answers long after his last breath, or what was supposed to be his last. The year was 1878, and while most in Arkansas were dealing with the remnants of Reconstruction and the steady decline of cotton profits, Elmer Grigsby was surviving something more personal and unsettling. According to town records, church diaries, and affidavits collected decades later, Elmer died, not once, not twice, but 12 separate times. Each time witnessed by at least one person of sound mind, pronounced by someone with some kind of authority, and each time returned. His first death came during the spring flood, when the Arkansas River had swelled beyond its banks, swallowing fences, livestock, and the first floor of many homes. Elmer had been assisting in sandbagging efforts near Pine Bluff when a retaining beam gave out and flung him into the rushing waters. Witnesses watched as his body was struck by a floating timber and pulled downstream. He was found the next day, tangled in a thicket of cypress roots, blue and lifeless, lungs filled with river water. A death certificate was issued by the local coroner, a man named Robert Terrell, who had been the town's only practicing physician. He was buried in a borrowed pine box at dusk. A cross was marked with charcoal and the year etched by a grieving neighbor. But Elmer Grigsby was not finished. 3 days later, he walked into the feed store, shivering and confused, asking if it was still Tuesday. No one quite knew what to do. Terrell retracted the certificate. The grave was exhumed and found empty. The coffin was split at the seams, as if pushed from within, though there was no sign of rot, clawing, or damage beyond the joints. Elmer couldn't remember much only. The cold and the roar of water. The town chalked it up to miracle, fluke, or mistake. Some even said he must have been mistaken for someone else. But his wife, Abigail, simply whispered to anyone who would listen that it was just the first time. She said it with a kind of resignation, as if she had expected it. No one wanted to ask her what she meant by that. By the second incident, fewer people believed it was a mistake. That time, Elmer was kicked in the temple by a startled mule. He collapsed immediately, bleeding from the ears, and a traveling doctor from Little Rock, who happened to be passing through, confirmed he had no pulse. That was on August 13th. He was placed on ice and prepared for burial. That night, the mortician's apprentice, young Davy Linthrop, ran screaming through the streets after Elmer sat up on the slab and asked for water. The next morning, the undertaker left town. He never returned. Stories like these tend to twist in the telling, but in Elmer's case, the official documentation only confirmed what the whispers already knew. His deaths were recorded again and again in different counties, under different circumstances: disease, accident, collapse, even lightning, but always with some witness, always with some kind of verification. And always he returned. Some tried to blame the doctors, misdiagnosis, primitive equipment, rural incompetence. But not every incident involved a doctor. Some involved ministers, judges, and once, a railroad conductor who insisted Elmer died in a passenger car halfway to Texarkana, only to find him an hour later drinking coffee at the depot. Was he faking? That became the dominant theory among skeptics. But faking 12 different deaths in 12 different circumstances over the course of 2 decades seemed a bit ambitious, especially for a man who lived in a town with barely 24 surnames. Those close to him began to notice changes, not just physically, though his skin did seem to pale after each return, and his strength diminished. His eyes, once bright hazel, began turning a shade closer to gray, but it was his demeanor that disturbed people most. Elmer became quieter. His speech slowed. He forgot names, places. And when he stared, which he often did, it was at something. Behind you, or perhaps within. His wife Abigail aged quickly in those years. She rarely left the house. It said she stopped attending church after the fourth death, despite having sung in the choir since childhood. She spoke little to others, but would sometimes be seen burning old letters in the stove at night, long after Elmer had gone to bed. In her journal preserved only because her cousin donated it to a county archive after her death, she wrote cryptic entries like, "I have stopped asking where he goes when he goes. I no longer want to know. And there is something wrong. With the light in his eyes, it's not just dim, it's watching." Elmer began keeping to himself, leaving the smithy to younger hands and tending to his bees in the orchard behind the house. The town's stories about him faded into background noise, a kind of accepted local myth that newcomers would be warned about, the way you'd warn someone about a slick patch of road or a snake den in summer. But then came the fifth death, arguably the most public and certainly the most disruptive. At the county fair of 1885, Elmer collapsed during a livestock competition. Witnesses say he had just hoisted a calf for weighing when he froze, turned his head sharply to the left and fell. He struck the ground hard and didn't move. The local deputy and a schoolteacher tried to revive him, to no avail. A doctor, present for the judging, declared him dead from heart failure. Elmer's body was kept in a tent overnight while a proper transport could be arranged. By morning, the tent was empty, and Elmer was found sitting near the Ferris wheel, dazed, eating a caramel apple. That was when the rumors turned darker. Some began to believe Elmer wasn't returning from death at all, that he was bringing something back with him. Chickens on his property were found dead with their eyes missing. A neighboring child claimed to see Elmer walking into the woods with a figure that looked like him but wasn't. The pastor of Grigsby's church stopped speaking to him altogether. He began referring to doubles and false men in his sermons. By the sixth death, no one wanted to be in the same room with Elmer for long. Whatever the truth, Elmer himself was of no help in explaining it. He offered no theories, no protests, no confessions. He would simply say, when asked, "I don't know where I go, but it ain't here." And so the mystery of Elmer Grigsby only grew. As the years stretched on, the question shifted from, how is he doing this, to something colder, more uncomfortable. What exactly is coming back? By the turn of the decade, Elmer Grigsby was no longer a man. He had become a riddle, an omen, a cautionary presence that stirred unease wherever he lingered too long. His name was still spoken in Jefferson County, but now in whispers and half-sentences, usually accompanied by a glance over the shoulder. There had been 6 deaths by 1890, 6 confirmed by witnesses, by doctors, by lawmen, and 6 returns. It would not be long before the 7th, but this section of his life, spanning from 1886 to 1894, was not about his deaths, not directly. These were the years when Elmer lived between deaths, when he walked, worked, and waited in the uneasy in-between. And during those years, it became increasingly clear that each resurrection came at a cost, one that no one, least of all Elmer himself, could quite calculate. A life slowly unraveling small town of Sulphur Springs, where Elmer and Abigail, relocated in late 1886, was nestled in the pine-covered ridges of southern Arkansas. The move had been Abigail's idea, perhaps hoping distance might dampen the fear their presence stirred in Pine Bluff. But news traveled slowly, and eventually it arrived. The story of the man who had died repeatedly made its way into backroom whispers, barber chairs, and pulpit warnings. The Grigsbys were never harassed directly. No mobs, no torches, just distance, polite refusals. Eyes that didn't meet theirs. Elmer opened a modest beekeeping business, selling honey and wax to neighboring farms. He no longer worked the forge. The heat seemed to affect him differently now. He would grow pale, sweatless, like a man freezing in a furnace. But the bees seemed to tolerate him, and perhaps more than that. Local boys said they never stung him, that he could reach barehanded into their hives and pull out combs as if parting curtains out at night. Abigail sometimes saw him standing among the hives, unmoving, as if listening to something in the hum. The Seventh Death, A Stranger's Perspective in April 1889. Elmer traveled to Little Rock to deliver honey to a general store that sold it as a tonic for the lungs. While crossing the iron bridge that spanned the Arkansas River, a bolt of lightning struck the structure. A freak storm had come in without warning. Witnesses said Elmer was the only one on foot at the time. The bolt hit the bridge's railing and traveled through the metal lattice, striking him directly. He was thrown backward onto the planks, smoke rising from his coat. A group of students from the Arkansas School for the Deaf saw it happen and ran to get help. When a physician arrived, 30 minutes later, Elmer had no pulse. His skin was scorched, and his boots fused to the soles of his feet. He was placed in a cart and taken to the city morgue, but by the next morning, his body was gone, and in its place was a smear of honey across the wooden table where he'd been laid. This was the first death documented entirely by outsiders, with no prior knowledge of his past. And it was this event that finally caught the attention of the state authorities. A young newspaperman, Ellis McCrae, who worked for the Arkansas Gazette, took an interest in the event. He tracked down Abigail 2 weeks later. Elmer was home, resting. McCrae interviewed him for nearly 2 hours, trying to provoke some confession of trickery or hidden science. But Elmer had little to say. Only one sentence, written in McCrae's notebook, stood out. "It ain't no trick, I'm just being borrowed." Borrowed, that word borrowed troubled McCrae. He published a half-page column about Elmer in the Gazette under the title, "The Man Arkansas Can't Keep Dead." The tone was mocking, skeptical, meant to amuse rather than alarm. But even so, the article was clipped and mailed across the country. Some took it as proof of hoax. Others saw it as an omen. A spiritualist journal from New York republished it with the subheading, "A Vessel Between Realms." Soon after, letters began arriving at the Grigsby home. Some begged Elmer for healing. Others demanded answers. A few, written and scrawled, and barely legible hands, warned him to stop returning, that the doorway was not meant to stay open. Elmer never replied. He stopped opening the letters after the third week. Changes in the mirror. By 1891, Elmer was fading. Not physically, though he had become gaunt, almost translucent in sunlight. He looked lighter, not in weight, but in presence. As if part of him was dimming, like the wick of a lamp with a dying flame. He began forgetting basic things, names of tools, the face of his neighbor, the taste of food. But strangely, he could recall in perfect detail the moment before each of his deaths, every smell, sound, temperature, even thoughts. He told Abigail that during the first death, he had felt peace. During the second, confusion. During the fifth, something like pulling. And in the seventh, just before the lightning strike, he claimed to have seen a doorway of bees, black, winged, forming an arch, and a voice whispering, "Again." Abigail told him never to speak of it again, but he did. To a pastor, to a peddler, to a runaway boy who stayed the night in their barn. Each time, the story grew less coherent, but the image of bees always remained. The eighth death, no body in the spring of 1892. Elmer vanished for 7 days. His horse returned alone, reins trailing, saddle intact. Abigail searched the woods with neighbors, but they found nothing. On the 6th day, a hunter claimed to have seen him by the riverbank, eyes closed, standing still in the water like a drowned man waiting to be pulled under. On the 7th day, he returned home with a bloody sleeve and no memory of where he'd been. This death was different. There was no declaration, no pulse taken, no body found. But something had left and something had returned. That much was clear to Abigail. who from that point forward refused to sleep in the same bed. In her final journal entries, she wrote, "He is here, but not. He watches me as if from behind. His own eyes, I don't think he knows what year it is anymore. And he doesn't cast a shadow at dawn." By the 9th, it became a curse. The Grigsby homestead fell into disrepair. Honey production dwindled. The bees became aggressive, stinging anyone but Elmer. Children said they followed him, hovering silently like attendants at a funeral. One girl swore she saw them enter his mouth as he slept. Locals began referring to him only as the dying man. In late 1893, Elmer collapsed again, this time in the middle of his yard, clutching his chest. The neighbor who found him swore he was cold, breathless blue. But when they returned an hour later with help, he was sitting on the porch, quietly rocking, sipping water. No one helped him after that. He became a kind of wandering ghost in his own town. Dogs barked as he passed. Babies cried. A mirror in the church shattered when he entered. The pastor declared him unclean. By the time Elmer reached his 11th death, he was no longer feared, just avoided. As though proximity to him might invite something else. People didn't think he was immortal. They thought he was borrowed, as he had once said. And that something was getting impatient about being owed back, because with every return, the gaps in Elmer's memory grew wider and the strange events followed faster. The final straw for most of the town came in early 1894. After his 12th death, perhaps the most violent of all, he was crushed beneath a falling cartload of timber near a logging camp outside Warren. Bones shattered, blood pooled beneath the wheels. His workers screamed. And yet, he returned the next day, dressed in the same clothes. No blood, no bruises. And he carried a bundle of honeycomb in his arms. But this time, something was different. His voice echoed when he spoke. His reflection didn't move when he did. And he no longer blinked. And so the town asked not if he would die again, but what would stay behind when he did. The question that haunted everyone, and that Abigail could no longer suppress, was this: if Elmer kept returning, where was the real Elmer now? By 1895, Elmer Grigsby was no longer considered a man in Jefferson County. He was a warning. Children were told not to wander near his home. Men crossed the road when they saw him coming. He was spoken of like a storm. That might pass if you didn't name it. But storms, at least, had a beginning and an end. Elmer no longer did. He still moved like a person, still spoke on rare occasion, still took care of his bees. But even his bees had changed. They no longer made honey. Their hives were sealed with something black and waxy. Locals said their buzzing sounded like whispers. A doctor who visited the Grigsby orchard in the summer of 1895 claimed he found no live insects, but the sound of wings followed him all the way home. And Elmer no longer aged. The final visit Abigail Grigsby left him that year, not with malice, not even with fear. She simply packed her trunk one dawn, left a tin of biscuits on the stove, and walked west. Her cousin in Fort Smith later wrote that she arrived with no explanation but a single phrase repeated under her breath: "I buried him, I buried him, I buried him." After she left, Elmer stopped speaking altogether. A census taker in 1896 noted that he was present, male, approximately 60, uncooperative. The same record added a handwritten note in the margin: eyes unresponsive, skin clammy, possibly. After that, Elmer simply vanished from public documentation. But oral histories, private letters, and newspaper fragments suggest something strange continued around the Grigsby land. The funeral with no body on. A cold morning in February 1897, a coffin was seen being carried out of the Grigsby home by two unknown men, pale, expressionless, wearing dark coats. No one in town recognized them. No one remembered being invited to a funeral. But the coffin was taken to the edge of town, to a small patch of woods behind the old church, where a fresh hole had already been dug. No preacher spoke. No eulogy was given. And when the town's constable arrived to ask questions, the men were gone. Just a box in the ground and no gravestone. Some believe Elmer was finally buried that day. That something, perhaps mercy, perhaps nature, perhaps some kind of payment, had finally claimed him. Others believe the box was empty, or worse, waiting. Wax figure in 1903. A group of traveling carnies stopped at Sulphur Springs. One of them, an old sideshow manager named Silas Jute, claimed to have once bought a real live man who couldn't die from a widow outside Pine Bluff. He said the man had skin like wax and eyes like river glass. Silas had placed him in a glass box and charged 10 cents for a viewing. But the exhibit didn't last. The figure began to mold, and the eyes never blinked, not once. So he buried it outside Harrison and forgot the spot. Jute was known to exaggerate. But a farmer near Harrison later claimed that one spring morning, his field was covered in bees, silent, still, arranged in a perfect circle. The bee theory spiritualists and folklorists who studied the Grigsby case in the 20th century began referring to something called the bee theory. The idea, loosely framed, was that Elmer had not survived death. Not at all. Rather, something had taken his place, something old, something communal, something that worked not as one but many. Bees, they pointed out, were creatures of resurrection in some cultures. Ancient Egyptians believed bees carried the souls of the dead. Celts saw them as messengers between realms. And in some rural Appalachian superstitions, if you didn't tell your bees of a death, they would bring the soul back themselves. Elmer had always tended bees, and after his third death, he had stopped informing them when someone in town passed. One letter from a visiting folklorist in 1911 claimed that Elmer may not have returned at all, but had been rebuilt, not by science, not by man, but by swarm. The disappearance of the house by 1908. The Grigsby home was abandoned. Or so people thought. A pair of drifters who took shelter there in the fall claimed they found the hearth still warm, a pan still hanging from the hook, and a sound not of footsteps but a low, constant hum, like breath made of wings. They did not stay the night. Years later, a fire consumed the orchard. No one knew how it started. But by then, no one visited the property. Bees hadn't been seen in the area for over a decade. The land was declared unfit for farming. The soil had gone bitter. No trace of Elmer was ever found. The wax baby in 1924. A child was born in Fayetteville with skin that doctors described as firm but pliable, like dipped wax. He didn't cry. He didn't blink. His heartbeat was erratic, and he refused to eat. His mother, a young widow named Clara, claimed she had no known relatives from Jefferson County. But on the day she gave birth, dozens of bees appeared in the maternity ward. There were no hives for miles. The baby was taken by researchers and never seen again. Some believe Elmer had returned. Others believed he never left. That part of him had moved on, perhaps into someone new. A quiet ending or beginning. The story of Elmer Grigsby faded slowly. The way fog slips back into the river it came from. His name was removed from census books. His land was never sold. And every now and then, when someone asked about the man who died 12 times, the answer was always the same: we don't talk about that. But late one summer, in 1932, an old woman passed through Pine Bluff on her way to Louisiana. She stopped at a gas station and introduced herself as Abigail Grigsby. She was nearly 90. She paid in silver dollars. And before she left, she told the clerk one strange thing. He asked me once if I thought the bees remembered where he came from. I never knew what he meant, but I think now. They do. She drove off and was never seen again. And so, the tale of Elmer Grigsby ends not with answers, but with hums in the dark, wings in the orchard, and a dozen deaths that never quite stuck. because the real question was never how he returned. It was why, and what else might have learned how.